The frontier does not forgive weakness, and the throne of Ashencrest has never once been built for mercy. King Alpha Draven Kaelor came home from the blood frontier broken, his body shattered, his bloodline declared finished by men who whisper behind closed doors that a ruined Alpha cannot rule. They were ready to bury his name before his heart even stopped beating. Then they sent him a bride nobody wanted, a girl hidden under sackcloth and shame, sacrificed by her own sister to save herself. Stay until the very end, because what happens between these two broken people will wreck you. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to know who's watching tonight. The carriage shuddered over frost-cracked stone, and Lady Seraphine Ashbourne pressed her spine against the wood paneling like she could disappear into it. Her hands shook in her lap. She'd wrapped them in linen gloves 2 sizes too large, the same way she wrapped everything about herself in too much fabric, too much silence, too much nothing. 18 years of practice making herself smaller than the room. It hadn't been enough. Not this time. "Stop fidgeting," Vesper said from across the carriage, not looking up from the small mirror she held, adjusting a pin in hair so pale it looked silver in the dying light. "You're embarrassing yourself before you've even arrived." "I'm not fidgeting." "You're breathing too loud. It's the same thing coming from you." Seraphine's jaw tightened. Outside the carriage window, the towers of Kaelor Palace rose out of the mountain fog like teeth breaking through gum, black stone and iron banners snapping in wind that smelled like impending snow. Imperial Legion soldiers lined the approach road in formation so rigid they might have been carved from the same rock as the palace walls. "Vesper." Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "Tell me again why it's me." Vesper finally looked at her. There was no cruelty in her sister's expression, which was somehow worse than if there had been. Just cold, practical calculation, the same look she'd give a ledger that didn't balance. "Because you smell like a fertility blessing nobody asked for," Vesper said flatly. "Because the moment I'm bonded to Lord Rowan, the first thing his nose will catch isn't me. It's you, 3 rooms away, sweating through whatever sack you've buried yourself in this week. I'm not losing my mate to my own sister's scent glands, so you go to the Broken King instead. He's half dead anyway. He won't care what you smell like. He won't care about anything. That's the whole point." The words landed exactly where they were aimed. Seraphine had heard worse from Vesper over the years, but never this clean, this surgical, like she'd rehearsed it in front of that same mirror. "And if he kills me," Seraphine said quietly, "on our wedding night. They say alphas like him do that. Snap a Luna's neck rather than touch her." "Then you'll have died useful," Vesper said, and turned back to her mirror. "Which is more than you've managed so far." The carriage rolled to a stop. Seraphine sat very still for 3 full breaths, feeling the cold seep through the floorboards into the soles of her boots, feeling her own pulse hammering somewhere behind her ribs, like something trying to claw its way out before the door even opened. Survive the first hour, she told herself. That's all. You don't have to survive the marriage. You don't have to survive the man. Just the first hour. The door opened. Frigid mountain air rushed in, and with it, the smell of pine smoke and old blood that never quite left a war camp, even one as polished as Kaelor Palace's outer courtyard. A steward in imperial black extended a gloved hand. "Lady Seraphine Ashbourne, the king will receive you in the Hall of Banners." She stepped down into the snow. Behind her, she heard Vesper murmur to the steward, something about luggage and accommodations, and whether her own chambers had been properly aired, as if she were the one being married off to a man the Empire called a living weapon. Seraphine didn't look back. The Hall of Banners stretched longer than any room she'd ever stood inside. Vaulted ceilings lost in shadow above iron chandeliers that burned low, deliberately low, like even the light in this place had been ordered to ration itself. War banners hung from every column, scorched at the edges, some torn clean through, trophies and warnings both. The Imperial Legion didn't decorate with tapestries of flowers and hunting scenes. They decorated with the flags they'd torn down from dead enemies. At the far end, beneath the largest banner of all, a black wolf rampant on crimson, stood the king. Seraphine's breath caught somewhere in her throat and stayed there. She had imagined him 100 different ways since the betrothal letter arrived, sealed in wax stamped with that same black wolf. She had imagined a monster, scarred and snarling, the kind of alpha mothers used to frighten children into obedience. She had imagined a corpse propped upright by stubbornness alone, since that was the rumor, that the great Draven Kalor had come back from the blood frontier with his body so ruined the healers gave him a season to live, maybe two. She had not imagined this. He was tall in the way mountains were tall, not just height, but mass, presence, the sense that the room had been built around him rather than the other way around. But even from this distance, she could see the cost of the frontier written into him. He stood with his weight favoring one side, a black cane gripped in his right hand, though he didn't seem to lean on it so much as hold it like a weapon he hadn't decided whether to use. The left side of his face bore a scar that ran from temple to jaw, still pink, still new enough that it pulled the corner of his mouth into something that wasn't quite a permanent scowl, but lived close to one. His eyes found her across the hall. Gold. Not amber, not honey, but actual molten gold. The kind of eyes that belonged to an alpha who'd shifted so many times in pure rage that the wolf had started bleeding into the man permanently. They fixed on her and did not move, did not blink, did not do any of the polite social softening most nobles managed, even when they were sizing up livestock. He was looking at her like she was a problem he hadn't agreed to solve. "Lady Seraphine Ashbourne," the steward announced, voice echoing off stone. "Of House Ashbourne." Nobody moved. The handful of court officials lining the hall stood like statues, and Seraphine became acutely aware of every layer of fabric she'd wrapped around herself, the high collar, the long sleeves, the wide skirts that hid everything from her wrists to her ankles. She'd dressed for invisibility her whole life. Tonight, invisibility was the one thing she couldn't afford, and the only thing she knew how to do. Draven's gaze dropped, briefly to the floor between them, then climbed back up to her face. He hadn't looked at her body. Not once. Most men looked at her body first, when they looked at all, hunting for the curve she tried to bury. He looked at her face like he was trying to read something written in a language he'd half forgotten. "You're late," he said. His voice was low, rough, scraped raw by something that wasn't just shouting orders on a battlefield. The ceremony was set for sunset. "The roads were bad, Your Majesty," Seraphine managed. "Snow on the mountain pass." He didn't sound like he believed her or disbelieved her. He sounded like a man cataloging information he'd need later and discarding the rest. "Doesn't matter. We're not doing this with an audience." He turned to the steward. "Clear the hall." "Your Majesty, the bonding ceremony requires witnesses for the Imperial Registry." "I said clear it." The words came out with an edge that made the steward's spine snap straighter on instinct, the kind of obedience trained into a body by years of proximity to something dangerous. "Two witnesses, the High Priestess and my second. Everyone else, out." The hall emptied in under a minute. Boots on stone, the heavy doors groaning shut, and then it was just the four of them, Draven, Seraphine, an elderly priestess in gray robes holding a ceremonial blade, and a scarred beta officer standing at parade rest near the doors. Draven limped closer. Up close, the scar on his face looked worse, deep enough that Seraphine wondered what had been used to make it, and the dark circles under his golden eyes spoke of a man who hadn't slept properly in longer than weeks. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, quiet enough that only she could hear. "We say the words. We complete the bond mark because the Empire needs to believe this marriage is real, and an unmarked Luna is a target for every ambitious house in Ashencrest looking to weaken the throne. After that, you get your own chambers on the opposite side of the palace from mine. You will not be expected in my bed. You will not be expected to produce an heir. The healers have made it very clear that particular function of mine doesn't work anymore, and frankly, I'd rather die knowing I never forced a woman into a marriage bed she didn't choose than live another season pretending otherwise." Seraphine stared at him. Whatever she'd braced herself for, walking into this hall, it hadn't been this. "You're telling me I'm safe," she said slowly. "I'm telling you I'm dying." His voice didn't change, flat as a blade laid on a table. "The healers gave me until the spring thaw, maybe less if the wound in my side decides to fester again. When I go, the bond breaks, and you walk free with the title of Widowed Luna, which carries enough protection and enough coin that no man in this empire will ever again force you into a corner you didn't choose. That's the arrangement. That's all this is. And until spring." Until spring you stay out of my way, I stay out of yours, and we both survive whatever the court throws at us in the meantime. He studied her for a long moment, gold eyes narrowing slightly. You don't look relieved. Should I be? Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. Most women would be. Most women weren't told they were a fertility blessing nobody wanted by their own sister 3 hours ago, Seraphine said before she could stop herself, and then immediately wished the floor would open beneath her. Draven's eyebrows lifted fractionally. It might have been the closest thing to surprise his face was built to show anymore. That what she told you? Her words? More or less. Charming family. He turned toward the priestess, dismissing the subject entirely, though Seraphine noticed something tighten in the set of his shoulders that hadn't been there a moment before. Let's get this done. The priestess stepped forward with the ceremonial blade. A thin silver implement meant only to draw a single line of blood from each of their palms, enough for the bonding mark to take. Alpha King Draven Kalor, the priestess intoned, voice cracked with age but steady. Do you accept this woman as your Luna, bound by blood and breath, in war and in peace, until death releases the mark? Draven extended his hand without hesitation. I accept. The blade kissed his palm. He didn't flinch. Lady Seraphine Ashbourne, do you accept this man as your king and mate, bound by blood and breath, in war and in peace, until death releases the mark? Seraphine looked at the blade, then at the king's open palm, blood already welling dark against his skin, and thought about the long carriage ride and Vesper's mirror and the way the whole world had decided, without asking her once, exactly what shape her life would take. I accept, she said, and held out her hand. The blade was colder than she expected. The cut stung less than the moment after, when the priestess pressed their palms together and murmured the binding words in the old tongue, and something deep in Seraphine's chest lit up like a struck match. She gasped. It wasn't pain exactly. It was recognition, a sense of being seen all the way down to the marrow, a thread pulling taut between her ribs and someone else's, and across the small space between them she watched Draven's jaw clench hard enough that a muscle jumped in his cheek. He felt it too. For one unguarded second, his golden eyes weren't flat or cold or cataloging anything. They were wide, almost startled, fixed on her like he hadn't expected the bond to actually take, hadn't expected to feel anything at all from a marriage he'd already mentally filed as a formality before his own funeral. Then the moment closed, fast, like a door slamming on a draft. He released her hand. It's done, he said, voice rougher than before. Welcome to Kalor Palace, Lady Seraphine. Someone will show you to your chambers. He turned and walked away, the cane striking stone in an uneven rhythm, and Seraphine stood alone in the Hall of Banners with a stinging palm and a thread in her chest that hadn't gone quiet, no matter how far he limped from the room. Her chambers, when she finally reached them, were larger than anything she'd lived in before, which felt less like a kindness and more like another way to be reminded how small she actually was inside this palace. Stone walls, a fireplace already lit, someone's small mercy. A bed with furs piled high enough to bury herself in, which she fully intended to do the moment the door closed. It didn't close fast enough. You'll want to remove that, said the woman, waiting inside. An older beta servant with iron-gray hair pulled back severe enough to match the rest of the palace, gesturing at Seraphine's high-collared gown. His Majesty keeps the eastern wing warm enough you won't need all that wool. And frankly, my lady, no offense meant, but you're going to suffocate yourself in this place if you keep dressing like you're trying to disappear into the walls. I like my walls, Seraphine said, more tired than sharp. The woman's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Mira, she introduced herself. I'll be tending your chambers. For what it's worth, I've served this palace 11 years and I've never seen His Majesty clear a ceremonial hall before. Whatever you did in there, you made an impression. I don't think that's a compliment. With him, it usually isn't. Mira moved to the wardrobe, pulling out simpler garments, soft wool instead of the heavy brocade Seraphine had arrived in. But I'll tell you something, since nobody else in this palace will. The king hasn't let a healer near him in 3 weeks, won't take the pain drafts, won't rest the leg like he's told. Man's trying to work himself into the grave faster than the wound will manage on its own. Seraphine frowned. Why would he do that? Mira's eyes flicked toward her, sharp and assessing in a way that made Seraphine feel, for the first time since arriving, like someone in this palace was actually looking at her, rather than through her. Because a man who's already decided he's dead doesn't see the point in suffering through the process slowly, Mira said. That's my guess anyway. Not my place to know his mind. But you might keep it in your pocket, my lady. Might matter before spring. She left Seraphine alone with the fire and the furs and the thread in her chest that still hadn't gone quiet. Seraphine sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, turning the cut on her palm toward the firelight, watching the thin line of the bonding mark already beginning to darken into the permanent shape it would take, a small black wolf print just below her thumb. A king who'd already decided he was dead. A man who refused his own healing because dying on his terms felt safer than living on anyone else's, including hope. She knew that particular shape of despair. She'd worn a version of it her whole life, just smaller, quieter, folded into 2 large dresses instead of battlefield scars. She recognized it the way you recognize a language spoken in a dialect close enough to your own mother tongue. The thread in her chest pulled, faint but insistent, in the direction she guessed his chambers must be. She ignored it and went to sleep. 3 nights into her residence at Kalor Palace, Seraphine woke to the smell of fever sweat and copper, sharp enough to cut through sleep and walls both, dragged forward by the same invisible thread that had been humming quietly in her chest since the bonding. She sat up in the dark, heart hammering, certain for one disoriented moment that something in the room had attacked her. But the smell wasn't here. It was somewhere else in the palace, distant, and yet she could taste it on the back of her tongue like it was happening 3 feet away. The bond. It had to be the bond. She was out of bed and into a robe before she'd fully decided to move, following the pull through unfamiliar corridors lit by guttering torches, past startled night guards who clearly hadn't expected the new Luna to go wandering the eastern wing at this hour and didn't quite know whether they had the authority to stop her. She found the king's chambers by following the smell of blood and fever to its source, and found Draven's personal guard, the scarred Beta from the bonding ceremony, standing outside the door with his arms crossed and his face carved from granite. "My lady, this isn't... Something's wrong with him." It wasn't a question. She could feel it now, closer, the thread pulling so hard it ached, fever and pain, and something underneath both that felt disturbingly like a man clenching his teeth against his own ending. "Let me in." His Majesty gave orders. No visitors, no healers. "He's not conscious enough to give orders right now, is he?" The guard's silence answered for him. "My name is Garen," he said finally, low. Second to the king since before either of us could grow a proper beard. "And I'm telling you, my lady, if you walk through that door and he wakes up to find you've seen him like this, he will never forgive either of us." "Then he can be angry at me once the fever breaks," Seraphine said, and pushed past him before he could decide whether to physically restrain the crown's new Luna in the middle of the night. The king's chambers were dark except for a single banked fire, and the smell hit her full force the moment she crossed the threshold, sweat and blood, and the sour rot sweetness of a wound that had gone bad days ago and was only getting worse. Draven lay tangled in sheets soaked through, his bare chest a map of old battle scars layered over one furious new wound along his ribs, the skin around it an angry red that spoke of infection, not healing. He was shaking, not the controlled tremor of a man in pain, the full-body convulsive shudder of a body losing the war against its own fever. "Get me water, clean cloths, and whatever herbs the kitchen keeps for fever," Seraphine snapped at Garen, who'd followed her in against his own better judgment. "Now! And someone needs to get the healers, regardless of his orders. He'll have my head. He'll have nothing if this fever isn't broken by morning. Look at him. That wound's been left to fester for days. Whatever pride he's clinging to, it's going to kill him faster than the war did. Move." Garen moved. Alone with the king for the first time since the bonding, Seraphine knelt beside the bed and pressed the back of her hand to his forehead, finding skin so hot it nearly burned to touch. Draven's eyes cracked open, glassy and unfocused, gold dimmed to something closer to dull amber by the fever burning through him. "You're not supposed to be here," he rasped. "You're not supposed to be dying of an infected wound 3 days into a marriage I didn't choose any more than you did," Seraphine said, reaching for the basin of stale water on his bedside table, the only thing available. "So we're both somewhere we're not supposed to be." He tried to sit up. The effort cost him visibly, a sharp inhale through clenched teeth, and she pushed him back down with a firmness that surprised even her. "I don't need," he started. "You need a great many things, Your Majesty, and right now what you need most is to stop arguing with the only person currently in this room willing to keep you alive." Something in his expression shifted. Not quite shame, closer to the particular exhaustion of a man who'd spent so long being strong for an entire empire that he'd forgotten what it felt like to let someone else carry weight for him, even for an hour. "My mother used to make a compress for fever," Seraphine said, working a clean cloth into the basin, wringing it out, pressing it to the worst of the heat at his throat. "Yarrow and willow bark when we had it. We didn't always have it. House Ashbourne wasn't generous with healers for the daughter nobody wanted seen in public. Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're delirious and probably won't remember it by morning," she said, "and because I think you'd rather hear something true than be comforted with something kind. Am I wrong?" He didn't answer, but his eyes, fever-bright and locked on her face, didn't look away either. "The wound," she said, nodding toward the ruined skin along his ribs. "How long has it been like this?" "Started festering 4 days ago." His voice had dropped to something rougher, stripped of the commanding edge it carried in the Hall of Banners. "Healer wanted to reopen it, clean it properly. I told her no." "Why?" "Because the last time someone reopened a wound on this body, it was on a battlefield with no anesthetic and 3 men holding me down, and I decided then that the next time anyone takes a blade to me, it'll be my choice or it'll be an enemy's, not some healer's well-meaning hands while I'm too weak to refuse." His jaw worked. "Pathetic, I know. Great commander of the Imperial Legion, terrified of his own physician." "It's not pathetic." Seraphine kept her voice steady, kept pressing the cool cloth along the line of his throat, his collarbone, anywhere the fever burned hottest. "It's a body remembering something it survived. That's not weakness. That's just what survival costs sometimes. Nobody walks away from a battlefield with their fear intact and their body unmarked. You don't get to choose only the scars you like." Draven was quiet for a long moment, breathing ragged, watching her with an intensity that had nothing to do with fever and everything to do with the strange fact that nobody had spoken to him this plainly in longer than he could remember. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "Neither are you." "What did you expect?" "A monster," she admitted. "Everyone told me you'd kill me on sight or ignore me until I rotted in some forgotten wing of the palace. Instead, I find a man who'd rather die of infection than let anyone see him afraid." His mouth twitched, the ghost of something that might have been a laugh if he'd had the strength for it. "And what did you find instead? Tell me honestly." "Fever makes truth easier to give, easier to take." Seraphine considered the question longer than she meant to. "I found someone who's already decided the ending of his own story," she said quietly. "And I think that's the saddest thing I've ever seen, because you're not dead yet, Draven Kalor, but you're living like the only thing left to decide is how. That's not strength, that's surrender wearing a crown." His golden eyes, dim with fever, held hers like she'd struck something he hadn't expected to be struck. The door burst open before he could answer. Garen returned with water, cloths, and a healer trailing behind him. An older woman who took one look at the wound and started barking orders with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd been waiting days for permission to do her job. Seraphine stepped back to let her work, suddenly aware of how close she'd been kneeling, how long her hand had rested against his skin. Draven caught her wrist before she could retreat fully. "Seraphine." It was the first time he'd used her name without the title attached. "You should rest," she said. "Stay." The word came out rough, almost involuntary, like it had escaped before he could decide whether he wanted to say it. Then, as if catching himself, his grip loosened. "Until the fever breaks. That's all I'm asking. You don't have to." She looked at his hand around her wrist, the bonding mark on both their palms catching the firelight, and felt the thread in her chest pull tight in a way that had nothing to do with survival instinct and everything to do with something far more dangerous. "I'll stay," she said. The healer worked through the night, reopening and cleaning the wound while Draven gripped the sheets and didn't make a sound beyond the harsh rasp of his breathing, refusing even now to show pain in front of an audience. Seraphine stayed beside him the entire time, pressing cool cloths to his face, murmuring the old fever songs her mother used to hum, not because she expected them to mean anything to a man raised on battlefields, but because the sound of a voice that wasn't shouting orders seemed to ease something tight in his shoulders each time she spoke. By the time gray dawn crept through the windows, the fever had broken, sweat-soaked and exhausted but alive, his breathing finally even, his golden eyes closed in something that resembled actual rest instead of the grim endurance she'd found him in hours before. Seraphine sat in the chair beside his bed, bone-tired, watching the rise and fall of his chest. She told herself this was duty. The bond required it. The Empire required it. Survival required keeping the man who could protect her from the wolves circling this palace alive long enough to be useful. She told herself a great many things sitting there in the gray dawn light, and believed almost none of them because somewhere in the last 6 hours, watching a king refuse to let himself be afraid even while dying, she had stopped thinking of Draven Kalor as an arrangement and started thinking of him as a man worth saving for reasons that had nothing to do with politics at all. That terrified her more than anything Vesper had ever said about monsters. He didn't remember it, or pretended not to, when he woke fully 2 days later to find Seraphine had returned every evening since, bringing tonics brewed from recipes she'd half remembered from her mother and half invented out of stubborn hope. Sitting in the same chair, saying very little, simply present in a way no one in his life had been present for a very long time. "You don't have to keep doing this," he told her on the 5th evening, voice stronger now. Color returned to his face, though the cane still rested against the bed within easy reach. "The arrangement doesn't require nursing." "I'm aware," Seraphine said, measuring willow bark into a cup of steaming water. "I'm choosing to anyway." Why? She considered lying, considered the safe answer, the one about duty and survival and the Empire's stability. Instead, she found herself telling him something closer to true. "Because nobody chose to take care of me either for most of my life," she said, not looking up from the cup. "And I always thought, if I ever had the chance to be the one doing the choosing instead of the one being left, I'd take it. So I'm taking it." Draven watched her in silence for a long moment, something unguarded moving behind his golden eyes, gone before she could name it. "My father used to say a king who can't be vulnerable in front of anyone eventually breaks somewhere nobody can fix," he said finally, quiet, almost reluctant. "I never understood what he meant until this week." "And now?" "Now I think he meant exactly what's sitting in that chair," Draven said, and the words landed in the space between them like something neither of them had been prepared to admit out loud. Not yet, not this soon, not with a wound still healing and a fever barely broken and an entire empire watching to see if their broken king would survive the winter. Outside the palace walls, in a chamber 2 floors below, Crown Prince Malrek read the healer's report on the king's recovering health with a stillness that betrayed nothing of the fury building underneath, and set the parchment down beside a second letter, already half-written, addressed to a contact in the Northern Territories who'd promised that the next attempt on Draven Kalor's life would not fail the way the festering wound had failed. The Luna had interfered with a plan 3 months in the making. She would not get the chance to interfere again. Snow fell heavier that week, burying the eastern wing in a hush that made every footstep in the corridors sound like a confession. Draven was walking again. Not well, not without the cane, but walking. And the healers who'd once whispered about amputation now whispered instead about miracles, about willowbark and yarrow, and a Luna who sat up 3 nights running with a king who refused to die on schedule. He hated being talked about like a recovering invalid almost as much as he hated how much he wanted Seraphine in the room when the talking happened. She found him on the training terrace at dawn, shirtless despite the cold, sweat already cutting tracks through the dust on his back as he worked through forms too slow and too careful to be anything but agony disguised as discipline. The scar along his ribs had closed clean, pink and puckered, a permanent map of the week she'd spent keeping him alive. "You're supposed to rest the leg," she said from the doorway. "I rested it for 6 days. 6 days is enough." The healer said 2 weeks. The healer isn't the one whose legion thinks their commander died on the blood frontier and got replaced by a ghost wearing his face. He didn't turn around, didn't break the rhythm of the form, though she could see the tremor in his left leg with every shift of weight. I show them I'm still standing, or I show them nothing, and nothing gets you a coup before the spring thaw. So you'll collapse in front of them instead. That's the better option. I won't collapse. He collapsed, not dramatically. His knee simply gave, the leg buckling under weight it wasn't ready to hold, and he went down hard onto packed dirt with a grunt that he immediately tried to swallow back into something that sounded less like pain and more like irritation. Seraphine was across the terrace before she'd decided to move. "Don't," he said when her hands reached for him. "I don't need— You keep saying that. It keeps being wrong." She got a shoulder under his arm anyway, hauling him up with a strength that surprised them both. Years of being underestimated finally paying out in the one moment it mattered. "You're not made of iron, Draven. You're made of the same meat as everyone else. The sooner you accept that, the sooner you stop bleeding into the dirt trying to prove otherwise." He let her bear his weight for exactly 3 seconds before pride reasserted itself, and he straightened, testing the leg, jaw clenched against whatever it cost him. "You're angry?" she observed. "I'm not angry." "You're breathing like a man who's angry." "I'm breathing like a man whose body decided to humiliate him in front of his own wife," he snapped, and then stopped, hearing the word land between them. Wife. He hadn't used it before. Always Luna, always the arrangement, always careful distance dressed up in formal titles. Seraphine didn't move, didn't push the word, didn't flinch from it either. "I'm not keeping score," she said quietly. "I'm not here to watch you fail so I can feel useful. I'm here because the alternative is watching you die slowly out of stubbornness, and I find I'd rather not." Something shifted behind his golden eyes, gold gone dark and unreadable. The particular stillness of a predator deciding whether to retreat or close distance. "Why do you care?" he said. Not cruel. Genuinely asking, like the answer mattered more than he wanted it to. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "I'm working on it." He studied her face for a long moment, close enough now that she could see the faint silver scarring around his throat, old wounds layered under new ones. A body that told the story of a man who'd survived more than the Empire would ever know to thank him for. "Work faster," he said, low, and there was something underneath the words that wasn't a command at all. Lord Rowan Ashford found her 3 days later in the palace gardens, where the last of the autumn roses clung stubborn and frostbitten to thorny stems, and Seraphine felt the temperature of the air change before she'd even turned to see him. "Lady Seraphine." His smile was the practiced kind, charming in a way that had probably worked on most women who'd never had to learn the difference between charm and hunger. Or should I say, Imperial Luna now? Quite the elevation for a girl who used to eat dinner alone in her chambers so Vesper wouldn't have to look at her. "Lord Rowan." She kept walking, kept her pace even, refused to give him the satisfaction of a flinch. "I wasn't aware the gardens were open to former suitors of my sister." "Former is generous. Vesper and I were never formally bonded. Just an understanding until your father decided House Ashbourne needed a more useful alliance." He fell into step beside her, uninvited, close enough that the scent of his cologne, expensive and faintly cloying, crowded the cold air between them. "Funny how things turn out. You, married to the most powerful man in the Empire. Me, suddenly available. I don't see how your availability is relevant to me." "Don't you?" His voice dropped, the charm sliding away to reveal something colder underneath, something that made the hair on Seraphine's arms lift despite her layers of wool. "Everyone in this palace knows the king is dying, Seraphine. The healers say spring, if he's lucky. You'll be a widow before the first thaw, sitting on a fortune and a title with no one to claim either. I'm simply suggesting that when that happens, you remember which man in this palace was kind to you before the crown made you valuable." Seraphine stopped walking. "You think I'm a prize to be claimed once my husband dies?" she said, voice flat with something that wasn't quite disgust, but lived close enough to it. "You think grief is an opportunity. I think survival is an opportunity, and you'd be wise to recognize one when it's standing in front of you." Rowan reached for her wrist, fingers closing with more force than the gesture should have required. You don't owe a dying man loyalty he won't be alive to collect. Let go of me. Seraphine, she asked you to let go. The voice came from the garden archway, rough as gravel and carrying an authority that didn't need to be raised to land like a blow. Draven stood in the entrance, cane in hand, the morning's collapse apparently forgotten or simply buried under something far more dangerous, golden eyes fixed on Rowan's hand around his Luna's wrist, with an intensity that made the temperature in the garden drop several more degrees. Rowan released her instantly, stepping back with the careful slowness of a man recalculating every assumption he'd just made. Your Majesty, I was merely escorting Lady Seraphine. You were touching what's mine without permission. Draven's voice stayed level, almost conversationally calm, which made it worse, made it land like a blade drawn slow enough that you felt every inch of the steel before it found the wound. I'm going to give you exactly one chance to walk away from this garden, Lord Rowan, and I'd advise you take it before I decide my recovering leg isn't quite the disadvantage you're hoping it is. For a long moment, nobody moved. Seraphine watched Rowan's eyes flick between the king and the cane, doing the same calculation everyone in this palace did eventually, weighing rumor against the man actually standing in front of them, the broken alpha against the predator whose golden eyes hadn't blinked once since he'd walked through that archway. Rowan chose correctly. Of course, Your Majesty. My apologies. He bowed, shallow and stiff, and retreated down the garden path without looking back, though his shoulders carried the rigid tension of a man whose pride had taken a wound he wouldn't soon forget. Seraphine became aware, in the silence that followed, of exactly how close Draven had walked while her attention was fixed on Rowan's retreat. Close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Close enough that the bonding thread in her chest pulled taut and singing, a current running between them that had nothing to do with survival or arrangement or any of the careful words they'd both used to keep this thing between them small. You came looking for me, she said. I felt something. His jaw worked, like the admission cost him. Through the bond. Fear, maybe. Anger. I didn't know what it was until I found you standing here with his hand on your wrist. It wasn't fear. Then what? It was the same thing I felt watching you collapse on the training terrace and refuse to let me help you, Seraphine said, holding his gaze, refusing to look away first. It was the particular fury of watching someone treat you like an object to be claimed instead of a person to be asked. I can handle Rowan Ashford on my own, Your Majesty. I've been handling men like him my entire life, but I won't pretend I'm not grateful you didn't make me handle him alone this time. Something in Draven's expression cracked open, just slightly, the careful control he wore like armor slipping enough to show the man underneath, raw and uncertain, in a way the Imperial Legion's commander never let anyone see. I don't know what to do with this, he admitted, low. What's happening between us? I told myself this marriage was an arrangement, a formality. I told myself the bond would fade once I was gone, that you'd walk away clean, untouched by whatever's left of me. And now? Now I find myself wanting to put my hands around a man's throat for touching your wrist, and I have spent my entire life learning to control exactly that kind of want, because a king who lets his instincts run his decisions ends up a tyrant instead of a ruler. His voice roughened further. But I'm finding it harder to remember why that control matters when it comes to you. The admission hung in the cold air between them, fragile as the frostbitten roses clinging to their stems. I'm not asking you to control it, Seraphine said quietly. I'm asking you to be honest about it. There's a difference between a man who lets his hunger rule him and a man who simply stops lying about having one. Draven's hand came up, slow, giving her every chance to step back before his fingers brushed along her jaw, calloused and careful, like a man handling something he was terrified of breaking simply by wanting it too much. If I'm honest, he said, voice barely above a whisper, I want to bury every man in this palace who looks at you like he has a claim. I want to mark you so thoroughly that no one ever mistakes what you are to me again. And I have spent every day since the bonding ceremony hating myself for wanting that, because I have no right to want it. I'm dying, Seraphine. I have no business claiming anything when I won't be alive to keep it. maybe that's not a decision you get to make alone. What do you mean? I mean, I have a voice in this too, she said, stepping closer, close enough now that she could feel the heat coming off him despite the winter air, close enough that the bond between them sang loud enough to drown out every careful, dutiful thought she'd arrived at this palace clinging to. And my voice says I'm tired of being something men decide about, instead of someone men ask. Vesper decided I was disposable. My father decided I was an embarrassment. Rowan decided I was an opportunity. You don't get to decide I'm something to be protected from your own wanting, Draven Kaelor. Not without asking me first. His golden eyes burned, gold gone molten in the gray morning light, and for one suspended moment Seraphine thought he might close the last inches between them entirely. He didn't. Spring is coming, he said instead, voice rough with restraint. And when it comes, you may be a widow before you've had the chance to decide whether you wanted any of this at all. I won't make that choice harder by giving you something to grieve beyond the title. He stepped back, putting distance between them with visible effort, and limped back toward the archway without another word, leaving Seraphine alone among the frost-bitten roses with her pulse hammering, and the bond in her chest aching like a wound that refused to close. Mime. That night, in Crown Prince Malrek's private study 3 floors below, a man in a hooded cloak delivered a report that made the prince's wineglass pause halfway to his lips. The infection failed to kill him, the man said. The Luna intervened before it could take properly. He's recovering faster than expected. And the second attempt? The carriage accident at the Mausoleum pilgrimage is scheduled for the Queen Mother's visit next month. Cliff Road, weak stone, easily arranged to look like natural collapse. The Luna will be in the carriage as well, given the Queen Mother insists on her company these days. Malrek set down his glass with deliberate care. 2 birds, he said softly. Good. The king's growing attachment to his little bride is becoming a complication. He's recovering his strength, his resolve, even his political instincts, all because some discarded daughter decided to play healer. If she dies alongside the Queen Mother, his grief does half my work for me. A broken man makes mistakes. A broken man trusting the wrong advisors, signing the wrong orders, blaming the wrong enemies. That's a king I can work with. And if he survives the grief intact? Malrek's smile carried no warmth at all. Then we proceed to the frame. The military intelligence I've been planting for the past 3 months is nearly ready. Falsified routes, falsified correspondence, all pointing to a commander who sold out his own legion to the northern rebels he supposedly defeated. By the time the carriage accident either succeeds or fails, the groundwork will already be laid to destroy him a different way. Steel didn't kill him on the blood frontier. Treason charges will finish what the frontier couldn't. He picked his wine back up, swirling it once, watching the candlelight catch the surface like blood in firelight. Either way, he said, Draven Kaelor does not see another summer on that throne, and neither does his bride, if I have any say in the matter. Seraphine didn't sleep that night, the bond in her chest restless and aching in a way that had nothing to do with fever this time and everything to do with the particular ache of wanting something she'd been raised to believe she had no right to want. She found Draven on the palace battlements near midnight, standing alone against the cold with his cane forgotten somewhere, weight braced against the stone parapet, looking out over a kingdom buried in snow and torchlight. You shouldn't be out here without the cane, she said, joining him at the wall. I shouldn't be doing a lot of things. He didn't look at her, jaw tight, profile carved hard against the dark sky. I keep doing them anyway lately. Like what? Like standing here instead of sleeping, because every time I close my eyes, I think about Rowan's hand on your wrist. And I think about every man in this empire who'll come sniffing around you the moment word spreads that the king's health is failing, and I think about how I have absolutely no right to feel the particular violence that thought puts in my chest. He finally turned to look at her, golden eyes dark in the torchlight. I was trained from the time I could walk to control my instincts. An alpha who lets possession rule him becomes a tyrant. I watched it happen to men in my own legion, good soldiers who let the wolf's hunger for claiming override every ounce of judgment they had, and I swore I'd never become that. But I'm standing here wanting to claim you so completely that no man in this palace ever looks at you again without seeing my mark first, and I don't know how to call that anything but exactly the thing I swore I'd never be. Maybe you're asking the wrong question, Seraphine said quietly. What's the right one? Not whether you want to claim me. She stepped closer, close enough that her breath fogged in the cold air between them, close enough to feel the tension radiating off him like heat off a forge. Ask whether wanting that makes you cruel or whether it just makes you honest. There's a difference between a man who takes what he wants without asking and a man who spent every night since our bonding standing on a freezing battlements wrestling with whether he's even allowed to want anything at all. You're not the tyrants you watched fall, Draven. You're the opposite of them. You're the man who'd rather suffer the wanting in silence than risk becoming someone who takes without permission. That's not weakness. That's the entire reason I trust you. His breath came rough, uneven, golden eyes fixed on her face like a man standing at the edge of something he'd spent his whole life refusing to fall into. If I touch you, he said, voice barely audible over the wind, I don't know that I'll be able to stop wanting to keep touching you. That's the truth of it. That's what terrifies me more than dying ever did. Then don't stop, Seraphine whispered. I'm not asking you to. The distance between them closed at last, his hand finding her jaw the way it had in the garden. Except this time he didn't pull back, didn't retreat behind duty or dying or the careful arrangement they'd both used as armor since the bonding ceremony. His mouth found hers, rough and searching and far gentler than a man built for war had any right to be. And the bond between them surged so hard Seraphine felt it in her teeth, in her fingertips, in the sudden desperate grip of her hands fisting in the front of his shirt. He pulled back only far enough to rest his forehead against hers, both of them breathing hard in the freezing air. Spring is still coming, he said, rough, like he was reminding himself as much as her. Nothing about my condition has changed. Then we have until spring, Seraphine said. And I'd rather have that honestly than nothing at all wrapped in careful distance. He kissed her again, and this time neither of them mentioned spring at all. The pilgrimage to the Imperial Mausoleum was announced 11 days later, Queen Mother Elowin's annual tradition of honoring the fallen Kylor kings. And when she requested Seraphine's company for the carriage ride along the mountain pass, Draven's expression darkened in a way that made Seraphine's stomach tighten with unease she couldn't quite name. I don't like it, he said that night, pacing his chambers with a restlessness that had nothing to do with his healing leg. The timing, the route, something about it sits wrong. It's a tradition, Draven. Your mother does this every year. I know what it is. I just don't trust anything in this palace right now that puts you somewhere I can't reach you quickly. He stopped pacing, raking a hand through his hair, golden eyes troubled in a way she'd rarely seen on him. Take Garen with you. Promise me that much. I promise. He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple that lingered longer than necessary, like a man memorizing something he was afraid of losing. Come back to me, he murmured against her hair. Whatever happens out there. Come back. 3 days later, the carriage carrying Seraphine and Queen Mother Elowin rolled along the cliff road toward the mausoleum, mountain wind howling against the windows, and neither woman noticed the way the stone beneath the wheels had been quietly, deliberately weakened weeks before, waiting for exactly this weight, exactly this moment, to give way entirely beneath them. The stone gave way without warning, a sound like the mountain itself exhaling, and the carriage tilted hard to the left before Seraphine had time to do anything but grab for the Queen Mother's hand. Hold on, she shouted, the word torn away by wind the instant it left her mouth. The world turned sideways. Wood splintered. The horses screamed somewhere above them, panicked and scrambling against a road that no longer existed beneath their hooves, and then the carriage was falling, actually falling, the cliff face rushing past the shattered window in a blur of gray rock and white snow. It caught. Some outcropping, some stubborn shelf of stone, snagged the wreckage 30 feet down and held, groaning under the weight, threatening to give way again at any moment. Seraphine found herself hanging half out of the broken carriage door, one hand locked around a splintered beam, the other still gripping Queen Mother Elowin's wrist with a strength she didn't know she had. Below them, the cliff dropped another 200 feet to jagged rock and a frozen river that wouldn't forgive a fall from this height. Let go of me, Elowin gasped, gray hair come loose from its careful pins, blood running from a cut above her eyebrow. Save yourself. You can't hold us both. I'm not letting go. Seraphine, I said, I'm not letting go. Her arm screamed with the strain, muscles she hadn't known she possessed shaking under a weight that wanted to drag them both into the ravine. The wood beneath her other hand cracked, a fresh inch of give, and somewhere far above she heard Garen's voice, frantic, shouting orders to the surviving guards. If we fall together. I'm not letting anyone else decide who lives and who gets left behind, not anymore. Not while I have a choice. It wasn't bravery, not really. It was something colder and more stubborn than bravery, a refusal carved into her by a lifetime of being the one left behind, the one sacrificed, the one whose hand nobody had ever bothered to hold on to when the choice was inconvenient. She would not become that for someone else. Not today. The carriage shuddered again, the outcropping beginning to surrender. Then the world above them exploded into motion, rope and shouting, and a weight descending the cliff face with a speed that should have been impossible for a man still healing from a near-fatal wound, and Draven was there, boots finding purchase on rock that shouldn't have held a goat, golden eyes blown wide with a fear that had nothing to do with his own survival. "Don't you dare let go," he snarled, reaching the wreckage, one arm hooking around Seraphine's waist, while the other took the Queen Mother's weight from her failing grip. "Either of you. Draven, your leg doesn't matter right now." The climb back up took longer than any of them had breath to track, Garen and a chain of soldiers hauling rope from above, while Draven bore the brunt of the weight on a body that had no business attempting this kind of strain, jaw locked against pain that Seraphine could feel bleeding through the bond between them like heat off a forge. When they finally crested the cliff edge onto solid ground, all three of them collapsed into the snow, breathing in ragged gasps that fogged the freezing air. Draven didn't let go of her, even flat on his back in the snow, blood-soaked from where the rock had torn his palms raw. He kept one arm locked around Seraphine like he was still afraid the mountain might reach up and take her after all. "I felt it," he said, voice cracking in a way she'd never heard from him. "Through the bond, the second the ground gave way. I felt you falling before anyone even reached me with the news. I'm here. You could have died." His hand found her face, smearing blood across her cheek, trembling in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "You could have let go of my mother and saved yourself. And instead you held on, and I have never in my life been so terrified of losing something as I was in that half second when Garen told me the road had collapsed." "I wasn't going to let go," Seraphine said quietly. "I told you. I'm done being the one who gets left behind." He pulled her against his chest, careless of the blood and the cold and the soldiers watching, and held her like a man who had spent his entire life learning to survive losses and had just discovered the one loss he had no idea how to survive at all. "I don't fear dying anymore," he murmured against her hair, low enough that only she could hear it. "I haven't feared it in weeks. But I am terrified, Seraphine, genuinely terrified, of a world where you're not in it. That's the truth I've been too much of a coward to say out loud." She felt the words land somewhere deep in her chest, the bond between them flaring bright and warm, even in the freezing wind, and opened her mouth to answer him. Imperial guards descended the slope before she could speak, 6 of them, armor gleaming dark against the snow, formation tight and purposeful in a way that had nothing to do with rescue. Garen stepped between them and the king on instinct, hand dropping to his blade. "Stand down. The king requires no escort." "We're not here for an escort," the lead guard said, and Seraphine watched something cold settle into his expression, the particular blankness of a man carrying out orders he didn't necessarily agree with but wouldn't dare question either. "King Draven Kaelor, by order of Crown Prince Malrek and the Imperial War Council, you are under arrest for high treason against the throne of Ashencrest." The words hit the clearing like a physical blow. "What did you just say to me?" Draven said, voice gone dangerously quiet. "Evidence has been presented to the council. Falsified military routes bearing your seal, correspondence with northern rebel commanders dated throughout the campaign on the Blood Frontier. You're accused of selling out your own legion's positions to the enemy in exchange for guaranteed survival of your command structure." The guard's hand didn't move toward his weapon, but the formation around him tightened, 6 against 1 wounded king who could barely stand without a cane. "You're to be taken into custody pending trial." "This is absurd," Seraphine said, stepping forward despite Garen's restraining hand on her shoulder. "He nearly died defeating the Northern Rebellion. He spent months recovering from wounds he took fighting them. You think a man bleeds that much for an enemy he is secretly working for? My lady, I have my orders. Orders from Malrek, Draven said, and something in his voice had gone very still, very cold, the particular stillness of a predator doing rapid calculation behind eyes that gave away nothing. My nephew, who has wanted this throne since before I left for the frontier, and who would benefit more than anyone alive from seeing me discredited and removed before I can produce an heir to challenge his claim. The evidence will be presented at trial, Your Majesty. I'm not in a position to debate its merits. Draven's gaze swept the clearing, the 6 guards, the rope still hanging over the cliff edge where his mother and his wife had nearly died not 10 minutes earlier. And something behind his golden eyes shifted, hardened, the look of a man doing math that none of them could see the full shape of yet. He understood something the rest of them hadn't caught up to. The carriage accident and the treason charges weren't 2 separate attacks. They were the same blade, swung from 2 directions, designed to land regardless of which one struck first. If the cliff had killed them, grief would have broken him slow enough for Malrek to seize power through manipulation. If the cliff failed, the treason charge was already loaded and waiting, ready to discredit and remove him through legal means instead. Either path led to the same throne, the same crown, sitting on a different head by spring. And the moment Seraphine understood it too, watching his face, she felt something cold settle into her stomach that had nothing to do with the mountain wind. Draven, she said quietly, what are you thinking right now? He didn't answer her directly. Instead, he straightened to his full height, despite the leg that still hadn't fully healed, despite the blood drying on his palms, and looked at the lead guard with an authority that hadn't diminished 1 ounce, despite the accusation hanging in the air between them. I'll go with you, he said. Peacefully. No resistance. Draven, no, Seraphine started. This isn't your decision, he said, and the words came out sharper than she'd ever heard from him, sharp enough that she actually flinched. He saw it. Something flickered across his face. Regret, maybe, or the particular agony of a man about to do something cruel for reasons he couldn't yet explain. Garen, escort the Queen Mother and the Luna back to the palace. Immediately. Your Majesty. Now, Garen. The forced authority in his voice brooked no argument, even from his oldest friend, and Garen's jaw tightened with visible reluctance before he nodded, already moving to help the shaken Queen Mother toward the waiting horses. Seraphine stayed rooted to the spot. You're not actually going to let them take you without a fight, she said. Draven, look at me. You're the strongest alpha in this empire. You could end this in 30 seconds, and we both know it. And prove every word of the treason charge true the instant I do, he said, low, urgent, the words coming fast like he didn't have the luxury of explaining slowly. A king who resists arrest with violence is a king who confirms he has something to hide. I have to go through this properly, legally. I have to let the court see the evidence is false because I let the process run its course, not because I forced it to stop with my fists. Then I'm coming with you. No. The word landed flat and absolute, and something about the way he said it made Seraphine's stomach drop in a way the cliff edge hadn't managed. What do you mean, no? Draven stepped closer, close enough that the guards couldn't quite hear what came next, golden eyes burning with something that looked almost like grief. Listen to me carefully, because I don't have time to say this twice, he said, voice low and fast. Whoever orchestrated this knows about the bond. They know what you mean to me now, and that makes you the second most valuable target in this palace after the throne itself. If they couldn't kill you on that cliff, they'll try something else, something subtler, something that doesn't leave evidence pointing back to a council member's office. I need you somewhere they can't reach you, and right now the only way I know to guarantee that is distance. So put guards on me. Lock me in the most secure wing of the palace. Don't push me away. I'm not finished, he said, and something in his tone made her go still. There's a second part to this, and I need you to trust me enough to let it happen without fighting me on it, because I won't have time to explain before it does. Draven, you're scaring me. Good, he said, low and rough. Be scared, be furious, hate me if that's what it takes to make this convincing. I need this palace, every spy Malrek has planted in every corner of it to believe absolutely that whatever happens next between us is real. Before she could ask what he meant, he turned away from her and back toward the waiting guards, and his expression transformed in the space of a single breath into something colder than Seraphine had ever seen on him, even in the Hall of Banners the night they'd met. "Take me to the capital," he said, voice carrying clear and hard across the clearing. "And get the Luna out of my sight. I've had enough of her interference for one lifetime." Seraphine's entire body went rigid with shock. "What did you just say?" Draven didn't look at her. Wouldn't look at her, his profile carved hard against the gray sky, jaw set like stone. "You heard me, Draven. I am formally severing this union," he said, loud enough that every guard, every soldier, every witness in that clearing heard every word land like a blade dropping. The bond was a political arrangement from the start, nothing more, and I see no further use in maintaining the pretense now that it's become a liability to the throne's defense against these charges. Lady Seraphine Ashbourne is no longer recognized as Luna of Ashencrest. She is to be escorted from Kaelor Palace before sundown and given no further access to royal grounds, royal funds, or royal protection. The clearing went utterly silent except for the wind. Seraphine stood frozen, the cold suddenly feeling like it had crawled all the way into her chest, into the space where the bond still burned bright and aching despite every word he'd just spoken. Through that bond, even now, she could feel something underneath his cold mask, something raw and bleeding that contradicted every syllable coming out of his mouth. But the contradiction didn't change what every soldier in that clearing had just heard with their own ears. The Alpha King had just publicly cast her aside. "You don't mean this," she said, voice shaking despite every effort to keep it steady. "I know you don't mean this." "I mean every word," Draven said, and finally, he looked at her, and what she saw in his golden eyes nearly broke something in her chest. Not coldness. The opposite. Agony. Carefully buried under a mask so absolute that no one watching would have caught it unless they already knew exactly what they were looking for. "Go home, Lady Ashbourne. There's nothing left for you here." He turned and walked toward the waiting guards without looking back, his limp more pronounced than it had been all morning, like the effort of walking away from her had cost him something the cliff climb hadn't. Garen appeared at her side, gripping her arm before she could move, before she could scream or run after him or do any of the things her body was demanding she do. "My lady, don't," he said, low and urgent. "Not here. Not in front of the guards. He just—" Her voice cracked entirely. "He just publicly humiliated me, discarded me, after everything. I know what it looked like." Garen's grip tightened, steering her firmly toward the horses despite her resistance. "Trust me when I say it's not what you think. But I can't explain why right now, not here, not with half of Malrek's spies probably watching from the tree line. Get on the horse, my lady, please." Through her shock, through the cold fury and grief tangling together in her chest, Seraphine caught the look in Garen's eyes. The same controlled urgency she'd seen in Draven's a moment before he'd delivered the cruelest words she'd ever heard from him. They were hiding something, both of them. She mounted the horse in silence, watching the guards march Draven toward the road that would carry him to the capital and whatever trial waited for him there, and felt the bond in her chest ache with a pain that had nothing to do with severing and everything to do with the particular agony of loving a man who had just sacrificed his own dignity, possibly his own life, to protect her from something she didn't yet understand. The ride back to Kaelor Palace passed in a blur of frozen wind and silent tears she refused to let fall in front of the soldiers escorting her, jaw locked tight enough to ache, the bond mark on her palm burning like a brand the entire way. By the time the palace gates closed behind her, word of the king's treason arrest and his public rejection of the Luna had already spread through every corridor like wildfire through dry grass. Servants who'd treated her with cautious respect for weeks now watched her pass with open speculation, some pitying, some hungry for the particular drama of a fallen Luna's disgrace. Vesper found her in the stripped chambers within the hour, where 2 guards stood waiting to escort her belongings out by sundown per the king's explicit order. "Well?" Vesper said, leaning against the doorframe with an expression that managed to be both smug and uncertain at once, like she hadn't quite decided whether to gloat or worry. "I did warn you, men like that don't keep what they're given. They use it until it stops being useful and then they throw it away. Get out, Vesper. I came to offer you a place to stay. House Ashbourne will take you back given the circumstances. Father's already drafting the announcement, framing it as a tragic political maneuver rather than a personal failing on your part. Better for the family name that way. I said get out. Something in Seraphine's voice must have carried more weight than it ever had before, because for the first time in either of their lives, Vesper actually obeyed without argument, retreating from the doorway with a final glance that almost looked like guilt. Alone, Seraphine sat on the edge of the stripped bed and let herself shake. Finally, the controlled composure she'd maintained through the entire ride back, finally cracking under the weight of everything that had happened in the span of a single morning. The cliff. The fall. Holding the Queen Mother's hand and refusing to let go. Draven descending the rock face with a body that had no business attempting it. The warmth of his arms around her in the snow, the words he'd whispered about fearing a world without her in it. And then, less than an hour later, the coldest cruelty she'd ever heard from any man in her life, delivered in front of a clearing full of witnesses. She pressed her palm against her chest, against the place where the bond still burned despite his formal severing of it, the mark on her hand still dark and present, no fading, no weakening, nothing about the physical sensation matching the legal reality he'd just declared in front of an audience. Bonds didn't sever that easily. She knew that much from the priestess's ceremony, from every story she'd ever heard about Luna mates. A king couldn't simply declare a bond ended and have it obey him, not unless the mate herself also released the connection, or unless one of them died. He'd lied. Publicly, deliberately, cruelly, in front of an audience he needed to convince, which meant Garen had been telling the truth in the clearing. Something else was happening here, something Draven hadn't had time to explain before circumstance forced his hand, and whatever it was, it had cost him enough that she'd felt the agony bleeding through the bond, even as the cruel words left his mouth. A knock came at the door, soft, hesitant. Mira slipped inside before Seraphine could answer, closing it quietly behind her and crossing the room with quick, careful steps. My lady, I don't have much time. The guards will check the room again within the hour, but I needed you to hear this before you're escorted out. Mira's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Garen came to find me, quietly. He says the king didn't mean what he said in that clearing. He says it was theater, performed for whoever's watching, because the moment word reached the king that you'd both nearly died on that cliff, and that treason charges were waiting regardless, he understood something the rest of us are only now catching up to. What? Whoever orchestrated this wants you dead too, my lady. Not just him, you, because you're the one thing keeping him fighting instead of breaking, and a king who's broken makes mistakes that get exploited. If he kept you close, kept you publicly his Luna, you'd have been a target with a target painted directly on your back for the rest of whatever trial's coming. By severing the bond publicly, declaring you cast aside and powerless, he's hoping whoever's hunting you will conclude you're no longer worth the risk of killing. A discarded former Luna with no political value isn't worth the attention an actual Imperial Luna would be. Seraphine sat very still, processing the weight of what Mira was telling her, the particular brutal logic of it settling into her chest like ice water. He sacrificed his own dignity, she said slowly, his own reputation. Let an entire clearing of witnesses believe he's a cruel man who discards women once they're inconvenient, all to keep me alive. That's Garen's understanding of it, yes. Why didn't he just tell me, in the clearing, before he said any of it? Mira's expression turned sympathetic, almost pitying. Because the moment he told you, my lady, you'd have argued, refused to leave, insisted on staying close to protect yourself, or worse, insisted on going with him to the capital to fight the treason charges at his side. And every second of argument in that clearing was a second too many, with armed guards waiting and Malrek's spies likely watching from the tree line. He had to make the lie convincing enough, fast enough, that nobody questioned it, including you, especially you. Seraphine closed her eyes, the full shape of it settling over her now, the brutal calculus of a man who'd spent his entire life making impossible choices in impossible moments, choosing in the space of a single breath to wound the woman he loved rather than risk her death. The bond in her chest, still burning despite his public denial of it, finally made sense. He hadn't severed anything. He'd simply lied to the entire empire to buy her survival, and the cost of that lie was every ounce of trust she might have built with anyone who hadn't been let in on the truth, including, perhaps most cruelly, herself. "Where is he now?" she asked. "The capital. The trial." 3 days' ride, my lady. Garen's already gone ahead with the guard escort. He asked me to tell you one more thing before I go. Mira's voice softened further. He said the king wants you to believe the lie completely, in front of everyone for as long as it takes. He said to tell you that he's sorry, that if there was any other way to keep you breathing, he'd have taken it, and that whatever you decide to do now, whether you stay hidden and safe or whether you choose something more dangerous, he understands either way. Seraphine sat with that for a long moment, the cold winter light fading toward evening through the chamber's narrow window, the guards waiting outside to escort her from a palace that had, for a handful of weeks, felt closer to home than anywhere she'd lived in her entire life. She thought about the cliff, about refusing to let go of the Queen Mother's hand even as the stone beneath her cracked and threatened to take them both. She thought about Draven descending the rock face on a leg that shouldn't have held his weight, terror in his eyes that had nothing to do with his own survival. She thought about every careful, halting confession he'd given her on the battlements, about wanting and control, and the particular fear of becoming the kind of man who took without permission. A king like that didn't discard a woman over political inconvenience. A king like that buried himself alive in a lie to keep her breathing, and trusted that somewhere underneath the wreckage of public humiliation, she would understand exactly what he'd sacrificed to do it. Seraphine stood, wiping the last of the cold tears from her face, and looked at Mira with an expression that had stopped shaking entirely, replaced now by something far more dangerous than grief. "Tell Garen something for me," she said. "Tell him the discarded former Luna isn't going to sit quietly in some forgotten corner of House Ashbourne waiting for news from the capital. Tell him I intend to find out exactly who forged that evidence, exactly who weakened the stone on that cliff road, and exactly how deep this conspiracy runs into the palace itself. The king may have given up his crown's protection to save my life. I don't intend to waste it hiding." Mira's eyes widened slightly, something like respect flickering across her weathered face. "My lady, that's not safe. If anyone learns you're investigating—" "Then I'll be careful," Seraphine said, "but I won't be useless. I spent 18 years being made small by people who decided what I was worth without ever asking me. I'm not going back to that. Not for House Ashbourne, not even for a king trying to protect me by making himself a villain in front of the entire empire." Outside, the guards knocked, sharp and impatient, announcing that the hour for her departure had arrived. Seraphine gathered the few belongings the king's order hadn't stripped from her, the bonding mark still dark and warm against her palm, the thread in her chest still humming despite every word spoken in that clearing to convince the world otherwise, and walked out of Kaelor Palace with her spine straight and her grief folded carefully beneath something harder, something that hadn't existed in her 18 years ago, 18 days ago, or even 18 hours ago. 3 days' ride to the capital, a trial built on forged evidence, a conspiracy running deeper into the palace than anyone yet understood, and a king fighting it alone behind walls of his own making, believing the only way to keep the people he loved alive was to push every single one of them away first. Seraphine had spent her whole life being the one left behind, the one nobody fought hard enough to keep. She was done letting that be the only story anyone told about her. Whatever it cost, whatever rules of careful, hidden womanhood she'd have to finally break, she intended to walk into that capital and tear the conspiracy down to its roots before it finished what the cliff and the treason charges together had failed to do. Before the empire lost a king worth saving, and she lost the only person who had ever looked at her and seen something worth protecting rather than something worth discarding. The carriage that carried her away from Kaelor Palace did not turn toward House Ashbourne. It turned instead toward the Capital Road, toward a trial that hadn't yet begun, and toward a fight that Seraphine Ashbourne, once the daughter nobody wanted to look at, intended to win on terms entirely her own. The capital rose out of the winter haze like a wound that had scarred over wrong, towers built on towers. The old stone city wrapped in newer imperial granite, the way a man wraps a bandage over an injury he refuses to let heal properly. Seraphine had never seen it before. She had no time to admire it now. She arrived at the Hall of Judgment 3 days after leaving Kaelor Palace, hood pulled low over her face, riding in the back of a grain merchant's cart, because a former Luna traveling under her own name would have been intercepted before she crossed the first checkpoint. Garen met her at the servants' gate, his face carved with exhaustion that hadn't been there a week ago. "You shouldn't have come," he said, pulling her into the shadow of the wall. "You knew I would." "I hoped you wouldn't." He scrubbed a hand down his face. "The trial starts in 2 days. Malrek stacked the council with men who owe him favors, or fear him too much to vote against whatever verdict he's already decided on. The evidence looks clean, Seraphine. Forged letters bearing the king's seal, witness testimony bought or threatened into shape, supply manifests that put Draven's signature on shipments that went straight to northern rebel camps during the campaign. Even I look at the paper and for half a second I doubt what I know to be true with my own eyes. Then we don't fight the paper. We find the hand that wrote it." Garen studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes, recalculating the woman in front of him against whatever soft, breakable image he'd carried of the Luna who'd nursed a fever for 6 nights running. "You've changed," he said. "I had a king sacrifice his own name to keep me breathing," Seraphine said. "I don't intend to waste that on caution." She found Draven in the lowest holding cell beneath the Hall of Judgment, stripped of his crown, his cane, even the black coat that marked his rank, dressed instead in the plain gray of a prisoner awaiting sentence. Torchlight barely reached the cell. The cold down here had teeth. He heard her before he saw her, and his head came up sharp, golden eyes catching the low light, disbelief cracking through the careful exhaustion he'd been wearing like armor. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, voice rough from disuse or from something worse. "Seraphine, if anyone sees you—" "Then they see me," she said, crossing to the bars, pressing both hands against the cold iron. "I'm done hiding because it's safer. I told you that on the battlements, before any of this. I meant it then. I mean it more now." He came to the bars too, close enough that she could see the new hollows in his face, the bruising along his jaw where someone had clearly not been gentle during his arrest, the way his hands shook slightly when they wrapped around the iron near hers, not quite touching. "I lied to you," he said, low, urgent, like he'd been waiting days to say it and the words had finally found a way out. "In that clearing, every word. I need you to know that I know," Seraphine said. "Mira told me. Garen told me. I figured most of it out myself, watching your eyes while you said it. You're a terrible liar, Draven Kalor, for a man who commands an entire legion." Something that might have been a laugh, broken and exhausted, escaped him. "I'm a fine liar. I've just never had to lie to someone I couldn't bear lying to before." "Then don't do it again. Whatever happens from here, we do it honest, or we don't do it at all." His hand finally closed over hers through the bars, calloused fingers tightening with a desperation that spoke louder than any confession he could have made standing free in a palace garden. "They're going to convict me," he said quietly. "I've seen the evidence they're presenting. It's good, detailed enough that even I had a moment of doubting my own memory of that campaign, and I lived every day of it. Whoever built this case spent months on it, maybe longer. This isn't panic. This is patience. Someone's been planning my fall since before I ever set foot on the blood frontier. Malrek. Has to be. He's the only one who benefits enough to justify the resources this took. But knowing it and proving it are different mountains, and right now I'm sitting in a cell with 2 days left to climb one I don't have the legs for." "You don't have to climb it alone," Seraphine said. "I've spent 3 days asking questions you couldn't ask from inside a cell. Servants talk to a discarded Luna with nothing left to lose far more freely than they'd ever talk to a king. People believe a woman everyone thinks is broken has nothing left to threaten them with." His eyes sharpened, the exhaustion burning away for one focused moment. "What did you find?" "A kitchen maid in the East Wing who used to bring meals to Malrek's private study. She says he's been receiving correspondence for months from a contact who signs letters with a sigil she didn't recognize, but described well enough that I'm fairly certain it's a Northern courier mark. The same Northern rebels you supposedly sold out your own legion to help." Seraphine's grip on his hand tightened. "I also found the mason who repaired the cliff road 8 months ago. He swears under his breath, when no one official is listening, that he reinforced that stretch of stone with his own hands and it had no business collapsing under carriage weight. Not unless someone weakened it deliberately, afterward. Names. I need names I can hand to the council. I'm working on it. But Draven, listen to me. She pressed closer to the bars, voice dropping. Even if I find every name, every letter, every piece of proof in the world, it means nothing if the council's already decided the verdict before the trial begins. You said it yourself. They're stacked with men who answer to Malrek. We can't win this with evidence alone. We need something that forces the truth into the open, where even bought men can't ignore it. Draven was quiet for a long moment, jaw working, golden eyes distant with calculation. There's a way, he said finally. Trial by combat. Ancient right, rarely invoked, but it's never been formally struck from imperial law. The accused can demand to face his accuser directly, in front of the full court, blade against blade, with the outcome serving as the court's final judgment, regardless of whatever paper evidence has been presented. Malrek would never accept that. He's not foolish enough to fight you himself. He won't have to fight me. Something dark and grim settled into Draven's expression. The law states the accuser may name a champion to stand in their place, provided the accused agrees to the substitution. Malrek will name his best blade. Probably Commander Theron, his personal guard captain, a man trained from childhood specifically for moments exactly like this one. You're in no condition to fight anyone, Draven. Look at your leg. Your hands are shaking just holding mine through these bars. I'm aware of my condition, he said, voice flat, final. I'm also aware that it's the only option left on the table that doesn't end with a council of bought men signing my execution order based on forged letters. I'd rather die on my feet with a blade in my hand, fighting for the truth, than die kneeling because 12 men were too afraid of my nephew to read evidence honestly. Then I fight beside you. Absolutely not. Draven, no, he said again, sharper this time, and his hand tightened around hers hard enough to ache. I have already watched you nearly die once on that cliff face. I am not standing in front of an entire imperial court watching you bleed for my name a second time. This is mine to survive or mine to lose, not yours. You don't get to decide what's mine to risk, Seraphine said, echoing words she'd thrown at him weeks ago in a frostbitten garden, words that landed now with twice the weight. I held the Queen Mother's hand over a 200-foot drop because I refused to let anyone else decide who gets left behind anymore. I'm not starting now, with you. Footsteps echoed down the stone corridor before he could answer, a guard's voice calling that visiting hours had ended, and Seraphine pulled back from the bars with everything still unresolved between them, the argument unfinished, the fear in both their chests bleeding through the bond loud enough to drown out the cold. Find me proof, Draven called after her as she retreated into the shadows. Whatever else happens, find me something solid enough to hand the court, because I intend to use every weapon I have, including the truth, and I'd rather not need the blade at all. But Crown Prince Malrek received word of the demand for trial by combat, with a stillness that betrayed nothing to the messenger standing in his study, though the wine glass in his hand cracked slightly under the sudden pressure of his grip. He's desperate, Malrek said, once the messenger had gone, turning to the hooded man who'd become a permanent fixture in the shadows of his study these past months. Good. Desperate men make reckless choices, and reckless choices are easy to exploit. You'll grant the combat? I'll grant it gladly. He hasn't fought at full strength since the Blood Frontier. His leg barely holds his weight on flat ground, let alone a combat circle. I'll name Theron as my champion, and Theron has spent 11 years training specifically to kill men exactly as wounded and exactly as desperate as Draven Kalor currently is. Malrek's smile carried no warmth at all. The court will watch their once great Alpha King fall in front of them, broken body confirming every word of cowardice and weakness the forged evidence already suggests. Nobody questions a guilty verdict delivered by the gods of combat themselves. And the Luna? She's been seen in the lower city asking questions she shouldn't know to ask. Something flickered across Malrek's face, irritation sharpening into something colder. She's becoming a complication faster than I anticipated. I underestimated how much spine that girl was hiding under all that wool. See to it she's discouraged from continuing her investigation. Quietly, if possible. Permanently, if necessary. though I'd prefer her death not traced back to this study a second time. One failed cliff accident is enough scrutiny for one season. The hooded man inclined his head and slipped from the room without another word, and Malrek turned back to his wine, watching the candlelight catch the crack now spreading slowly across the glass in his hand, a fracture line he hadn't noticed forming until it had already gone too far to stop. Busk. Seraphine felt the danger before she fully understood its shape, a prickling awareness at the back of her neck as she crossed the lower city market 2 days before the trial. The same instinct that had once kept her invisible in House Ashbourne's hostile corridors now screaming that she was being followed. She didn't run. Running announced fear, and fear invited pursuit. Instead, she turned into a narrow alley between a tanner's shop and a bakery long closed for the night, moving with deliberate, unhurried steps that gave nothing away, and waited. The man who followed her into the alley was broad, scarred, moving with the economical precision of someone who'd killed before and expected this to be just as simple. "Wrong turn, my lady," he said, blocking the alley's only exit. "This part of the city isn't safe for women asking the kinds of questions you've been asking." "I'm aware of exactly how unsafe it is," Seraphine said, backing slowly, calculating the distance to the alley's far end, the height of the wall there, whether she could climb it before he closed the gap. "Funny, though, I didn't think Crown Prince Malrek employed men quite this clumsy. You announced yourself before you'd even drawn a blade." Something flickered across his face, a flash of surprise quickly buried, confirming exactly what she'd suspected the moment his shadow fell across the market stalls behind her. "Clever girl," he said, drawing a short blade from beneath his coat. "Won't save you." He lunged. Seraphine threw herself sideways, the blade catching nothing but air and the edge of her cloak, and she scrambled toward a stack of empty crates with a desperation that had nothing elegant about it. Pure animal survival overriding every careful lesson House Ashbourne had ever taught her about composure. The crates bought her 3 seconds. 3 seconds was enough to grab the iron poker leaning against the bakery's cold oven, abandoned by some baker who'd never imagined it would be needed for anything but stoking coals. The man came at her again, and this time Seraphine didn't run. She swung the poker with every ounce of fury that had been building in her chest since a clearing on a mountain road, since a sister's cold calculation in a carriage, since 18 years of being told her only value lay in what she could be sacrificed for. The poker caught his wrist, hard enough to crack bone, the blade clattering from his suddenly useless fingers, and before he could recover, Seraphine drove her knee up into him with a force that dropped him gasping to the cobblestones. She stood over him, chest heaving, the poker still raised, blood roaring in her ears loud enough to drown out everything except the sudden, fierce clarity of having survived something that should have killed her. "Tell Malrek," she said, voice shaking but clear, "that the next assassin he sends had better come better prepared than this. Tell him the discarded Luna isn't nearly as easy to discard as he assumed." She left him groaning in the alley and didn't look back, walking fast through the lower city's narrow streets with her heart still hammering, the poker still gripped white-knuckled in her hand, until she reached the safe house Garen had arranged near the city's eastern gate. He took one look at her, at the blood not her own staining the hem of her cloak, and his face went pale. "What happened?" "Malrek's getting nervous," Seraphine said, finally letting her hands shake now that she was somewhere relatively safe. "Which means we're closer to something he's desperate to bury. I need that Mason's testimony in writing, witnessed, before the trial. And I need to know everything about Commander Theron's combat record, every weakness, every habit, every tell, because in 2 days he's going to try to kill the only man I have ever actually wanted to keep." Garen studied her for a long moment, something like genuine respect settling into his expression. "You're not what anyone in that palace expected you to be," he said. "Good," Seraphine said. "I'm tired of being what people expect." The morning of the trial dawned gray and bitter. The hall of judgment packed beyond capacity with nobles, court officials, and curious citizens who'd waited in the cold since before dawn for the chance to witness an Alpha King's fall from grace. Crown Prince Malrek sat at the head table beside the assembled council, composed and patient, the picture of a man entirely confident in the outcome already decided. Draven was led in chains down the center aisle, stripped to fighting leathers instead of prisoner gray now that the combat had been granted, his leg dragging slightly with every step, the months of healing visibly insufficient against what waited for him in the combat circle. Seraphine watched from the gallery, hood drawn low, fingers white-knuckled around the rail, and felt the bond in her chest twist with an anguish so sharp it nearly doubled her over when his eyes found hers across the crowded hall, just for a moment, just long enough to confirm she'd kept her promise and come. Commander Theron entered from the opposite side, massive and unscarred, every inch the picture of a warrior in his prime, blade already drawn and gleaming under the hall's torchlight. "Let the trial by combat begin," the chief magistrate intoned, voice carrying over the assembled crowd. "The outcome shall stand as the court's final and binding judgment, regardless of evidence previously presented. May the gods of steel favor the honest blade." The combat circle had been chalked into the stone floor at the hall's center, 30 feet across. No escape, no mercy implied in its boundaries. Draven's chains were struck away. He rolled his shoulders, testing the leg that had nearly buckled under him on a training terrace not 3 weeks prior, and accepted a blade from the armory steward with hands that, Seraphine noted with her heart in her throat, were no longer shaking. He met Theron's eyes across the circle. "Last chance to reconsider," Draven said, voice carrying despite its roughness, carrying the particular calm of a man who had already decided that surviving wasn't the only thing left worth fighting for. "You're a good soldier, Theron. I trained half your unit myself years ago. You don't have to die for Malrek's ambition." "I'm not planning to die at all, Your Majesty," Theron said, settling into a fighting stance that spoke of 11 years of dedicated brutality. "I'm planning to watch you do that slowly in front of every noble house in this empire. Then let's see whose plan survives the hour." The magistrate's blade dropped, signaling the start, and the combat circle exploded into motion. Theron came in fast, testing, a series of probing strikes meant to gauge how badly the leg had compromised Draven's footwork, and Draven gave ground deliberately, letting the younger man believe the gap in skill was wider than it actually was. Every retreat calculated, every stumble half feigned to draw Theron's confidence forward into overextension. Seraphine's nails dug crescents into her palms, watching blood already beading along a shallow cut on Draven's forearm, where Theron's blade had finally found purchase. Watching the crowd lean forward with the particular hunger of an audience that had paid for exactly this kind of violence. This is what power actually costs, she thought, watching him circle, watching sweat cut through the blood already drying on his skin, watching a king who had everything stripped from him, crown, title, even his own public dignity, fight with nothing left to protect except the truth and the woman watching from the gallery. Nobody becomes truly dangerous until they have nothing left to lose. Nobody becomes truly unbreakable until breaking has already happened, and they're still standing afterward anyway. Draven's leg buckled on a hard pivot, just slightly, just enough, and Theron lunged for the opening with the eager precision of a predator who'd finally found his opportunity. It was a trap. Draven dropped low into the buckle instead of fighting it. Using the collapse to drive his shoulder into Theron's exposed ribs, turning weakness into momentum with a brutal economy that spoke of a man who'd survived a literal war by learning exactly how to weaponize his own broken body. Theron staggered back, breath driven from his lungs in a sharp grunt, and Draven pressed the advantage with a flurry of strikes that drove the larger man back toward the circle's chalked edge. The crowd's murmur shifted, surprise rippling through the gallery, Malrek's composed expression cracking for the first time since the trial began. "He's better than the reports suggested," someone murmured behind Seraphine. "He's not better," Seraphine said, more to herself than anyone listening. "He's just got more reason to win." Theron recovered, snarling, abandoning caution for raw aggression, and the fight turned vicious in a way that made Seraphine's stomach clench, blade against blade in a rhythm too fast to fully track, sparks striking off steel in the torchlit hall, both men bleeding now from a dozen shallow wounds that promised worse to come the longer the combat dragged on. Draven's strength was failing. Seraphine could see it even from the gallery, the particular hitch in his breathing, the way his sword arm had begun trembling between exchanges, months of healing simply insufficient against 11 years of a younger man's dedicated brutality. Theron saw it too. He pressed harder, driving Draven back toward the circle's edge with a series of strikes that left no room for the clever, economical defense that had carried him through the fight's opening minutes. and Seraphine watched with her heart in her throat as Draven's guard finally, inevitably, began to fail. A strike got through. Theron's blade opened a long gash along Draven's ribs, dangerously close to the wound that had nearly killed him with fever weeks before, and the king staggered, blood blooming dark and fast across his fighting leathers, knee hitting stone as the leg finally gave out entirely beneath him. The gallery erupted, half in horror, half in the particular bloodthirsty excitement of an audience watching exactly the kind of fall they'd come to witness. Theron stood over him, blade raised for the finishing strike, and Malrek rose from his seat at the council table with an expression that finally, openly, allowed itself the satisfaction of a man watching 8 months of careful planning reach its conclusion. Seraphine's scream tore out of her before she'd decided to make a sound at all, her hood falling back, her identity exposed to the entire hall. In the same instant, Theron's blade began its downward arc toward a king kneeling broken on the stone floor, blood pooling dark beneath him, golden eyes lifting one last time across the chaos of the gallery to find her face among the screaming crowd, the last thing he intended to see before the steel found its mark. Theron's blade never landed. Not because of steel, not because of any warrior's intervention, but because Seraphine's voice cracked through the hall like a whip, raw and furious, and carrying something that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with the particular authority of a woman who had finally run out of patience with being quiet. "I have a witness," she shouted, standing exposed in the gallery with her hood gone and her identity no longer anyone's secret. A signed testimony, witnessed by 2 merchants and the city's eastern gate notary, from the mason who repaired the cliff road 8 months ago. The same cliff road that collapsed under a carriage carrying the Queen Mother and the Imperial Luna 3 weeks past. The hall went silent the way halls only go silent when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Theron's blade hovered. Draven, blood-soaked and kneeling, didn't move, golden eyes locked on Seraphine's face across the gallery with an expression that had stopped being the controlled mask of a king and become something rawer and more honest than anything he'd shown a public audience in his entire reign. The mason's testimony states the road was structurally sound when he finished the repair, Seraphine continued, her voice steady despite the terror hammering behind her ribs, despite the fact that every set of eyes in the hall had turned to her, and half of them belonged to men who answered to the crown prince now watching from the council table with a stillness that had turned dangerous. It also states that he was approached 3 weeks before the pilgrimage by a man he identified by a sigil, a northern courier's mark, and offered coin to look the other way while someone else worked the stone. He refused the coin. He didn't refuse to remember the face. She reached into her cloak and held up the sealed document, small and unremarkable from this distance, but carrying the kind of weight that forged letters and bought testimony could never manufacture, because it came from a man with nothing to gain and everything to lose by telling the truth in a city that had spent months being arranged against it. Malrek rose from his chair, slow and deliberate, the mask of composed certainty still in place, though something had begun moving behind his eyes that Seraphine recognized. The same calculation she'd seen in Vesper's face the day she was sacrificed to a dying king. The frantic internal arithmetic of a man discovering that the problem he'd dismissed as already solved had come back with a different shape entirely. "This is a disruption of a lawful imperial proceeding," Malrek said, voice carrying the confident weight of a man accustomed to rooms that obeyed him. "Remove her." Nobody moved. The guards near the gallery door exchanged glances, hands going to hilts without drawing, the particular paralysis of men caught between a direct order from the crown prince and something they could feel in the room shifting beneath their feet like ground before an avalanche. Because Theron had taken one step back from the kneeling king, the finishing blow still undelivered, and in that single step something had changed in the hall's dynamics, subtle and enormous at once, like the moment a fire realizes the wind has changed direction. "I also have correspondence," Seraphine said, pulling a second document from her cloak, her hand shaking but her voice refusing to follow. "Found in the private effects of a courier who arrived in the capital 4 days ago from the northern territories and was paid in imperial coin bearing this year's mint mark, to carry a letter signed with a name I believe this council will recognize." She paused, long enough for the silence to become its own kind of statement. The letter instructs the recipient to falsify military supply manifests, alter correspondence archives, and produce 3 witnesses willing to testify to communications they never actually saw. It also discusses a planned accident on a specific cliff road, a specific date, 2 specific passengers. The letter she held up bore the seal of the Crown Prince's private signet ring. The hall didn't just go quiet. It went the particular frozen silence of a moment that everyone present understood they would be describing for the rest of their lives. The moment the ground finally opened under 8 months of careful construction and let it all fall into the dark. Malrek's composure broke. Not dramatically, not all at once. It happened the way ice cracks on a deep river, the fissure appearing so fast that by the time you heard the sound, the whole surface had already begun to give way, one decisive fracture spreading outward in every direction simultaneously. "She's lying," he said, and the flatness of his voice betrayed him entirely, because a man who was certain of the truth didn't need to declare someone else a liar before they'd even finished speaking. He needed to disprove them. Certainty disproves. Panic accuses. Every document she's holding is fabricated. She's a discarded Luna with a grudge against the crown, motivated by her own humiliation and whatever desperate fantasies she's constructed to explain why the man she served chose to release her rather than keep her. "Then challenge the witnesses," said a voice from the council table. Malrek turned toward it, and Seraphine watched the moment he identified the speaker, a senior councilman named Lord Aldrich, who had served 3 Kalar kings without political allegiance to any cause except the Empire's continued survival, and whose support had never once been secured or promised to anyone in this hall. "Challenge them publicly," Aldrich said, unhurried, in the voice of a man who had seen enough imperial machinations to recognize the particular smell of one reaching its natural conclusion. "The documents exist or they don't. The witnesses can be questioned under oath or they can't. The law provides a mechanism for exactly this kind of competing evidence, Your Highness. It's called a full council review, and I'm formally requesting one, effective immediately, as is my right under the Imperial Charter you've been invoking all morning to justify everything else in this hall." The hall erupted. Not cleanly, not in any organized direction, the noise of 300 people simultaneously recalculating their positions, their loyalties, their survival, the particular chaos of a political reality restructuring itself in real time around new information that couldn't be shoved back into the box it had come from. In the center of the combat circle, Draven finally moved. He pushed himself to his feet, not cleanly, not without the visible cost of a body already past its limits, one hand braced on his own knee to lever himself upright. The blood-soaked leathers and the torn gash along his ribs making the effort look exactly as brutal as it was. But he stood, and standing, he looked across the chaos of the hall toward the council table where Malrek had gone very still in the way that predators go still, not calm, but calculating the geometry of remaining exits. "Malrek," Draven said, voice carrying over the noise without effort, the battlefield commander's projection that cut through chaos as reflexively as breathing. "Don't run." Something passed between them across the length of the hall, uncle and nephew, king and conspirator, the ruined end of whatever version of this relationship might have existed before ambition consumed everything else. Malrek ran. He made for the side door beside the council table, a servant's passage that Seraphine suspected he'd located and memorized months ago in exactly this kind of contingency, the careful preparation of a man who planned for failure the same way he planned for success, and he nearly made it. Garen had been standing beside that door for 40 minutes. He stepped into the passage entrance with a calm deliberateness that left no room for negotiation, and Crown Prince Malrek, who had spent 8 months orchestrating the destruction of an empire's finest commander without ever once doing his own dirty work, found himself face to face with a beta soldier who had served Draven Kalar since before either of them could grow a proper beard, and who had precisely no patience remaining for any of this. The arrest was not gentle. It did not need to be. Tramat. The full council review took 3 days, not 3 months, which was a testament to what happened when the men doing the reviewing understood that the political winds had turned entirely, and that the only survival strategy left available was to get in front of the correct verdict fast enough to be seen as principled rather than panicked. Seraphine testified for 4 hours on the second day, dressed plainly, without the imperial Luna's title she technically no longer held, speaking in the flat, specific language of facts and timelines that courtrooms responded to better than passion, though the passion was there underneath, carefully folded, held in reserve for the moment it would be needed. The Mason testified. The courier, offered immunity for cooperation, testified. A kitchen maid from the East Wing Palace testified about correspondence she'd carried without understanding, about sigils she'd memorized without intending to, about a crown prince who'd assumed that the invisibility of servants was the same thing as the absence of witnesses. It never was. People like Seraphine had spent their entire lives understanding the particular freedom of being underestimated. The way invisibility granted by other people's contempt became its own kind of power the moment you decided to use it deliberately rather than endure it passively. On the third day, the council returned its verdict. The treason charges against King Alpha Draven Kalor were formally dismissed. The forged evidence struck from the imperial record. The witnesses against him identified as having testified under duress or financial coercion. Crown Prince Malrek was formally charged with conspiracy against the throne, attempted regicide, and the premeditated murder of imperial subjects through the deliberate sabotage of the Cliff Road. Draven received the verdict in the Hall of Judgment with his arm in a healer's sling and Garen standing at his left shoulder, and his expression held none of the triumph Seraphine might have expected from a man who'd just been publicly vindicated after the worst weeks of his life. He looked tired, genuinely, deeply tired, in the way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the particular exhaustion of a man who had just spent months watching everything he'd built get systematically dismantled and then had to stand in the wreckage of it and decide what kind of person he intended to be on the other side. He found her eyes across the council chamber, the way he always found her eyes across rooms, like some part of him had mapped her location before he was consciously aware of looking. And what was in his gaze when he did was something Seraphine had never seen from him before. Not relief, not vindication, not the cold strategic calm he'd worn through the trial itself. Just her name, written in gold, in the particular way a man looks at the thing that survived every attempt to destroy it and is only now beginning to believe it's actually still there. The sentencing of Malrek happened privately, before the full council, but without the public gallery that had packed the Hall of Judgment for the trial. Draven had requested it that way, and the council, in the chastened compliance of men who understood they'd nearly signed an innocent king's execution order, had granted it without argument. Malrek stood before the throne in chains that were ceremonial in form and entirely real in function, and looked at the uncle he'd tried to destroy with an expression that had finally exhausted all its masks, and arrived at something that might have been the first honest thing Seraphine had ever seen on his face. Not remorse. She didn't think Malrek had quite arrived at remorse yet, but a kind of hollowed recognition, the look of a man who had wanted something so completely and so long that he'd stopped being able to imagine the version of himself that might have wanted something else instead. And now that the wanting had failed, there was nothing underneath it to fall back on. "I could have you executed," Draven said, standing before the throne rather than sitting on it, which was a choice Seraphine noticed even if no one else remarked on it. A man standing to deliver a sentence was a man who understood that the throne was a burden, not a platform. "The law supports it. The evidence warrants it. You tried to kill my mother and my wife on that cliff road. You tried to kill me on a battlefield through sabotage before that, didn't you? The supply routes and the manifests, the delayed reinforcements at the Third Ridge engagement. I thought it was incompetence at the time. It wasn't, was it?" Malrek said nothing, but the silence confirmed it more completely than words could have. "I'm not going to execute you," Draven said. Something shifted in Malrek's expression, surprise breaking through the hollowness. "Not because I'm merciful," Draven said, reading the surprise correctly, "and not because I think you've earned leniency. I'm not executing you because power gained through the death of someone who wronged me doesn't clean the wound. It just moves the rot into a different shape. My father tried to teach me that years before I was ready to understand it. I understand it now." He let the silence settle for a moment, unhurried. "You'll be stripped of your title, your holdings, and your claim to any imperial succession. You'll spend the next 15 years in the Northern Territories, The same territories whose rebels you armed against my legion, building the roads and bridges your military contacts helped destroy. When 15 years have passed, if you've done the work honestly, you may petition the council for a review of your status. Not forgiveness. A review. Whether you've earned anything at that point is a question you'll spend 15 years finding an answer to. That's not justice, Malrek said. First words he'd spoken in the entire proceedings. No, Draven agreed. It's harder than justice. Justice ends at the sentence. What I'm offering is the possibility, not the guarantee of becoming something worth more than your worst decision. Most men in your position wouldn't get even that. He stepped closer, voice dropping to something that carried only between them. I spent months convinced I was going to die before spring, and the thing that kept me alive long enough to stand in this room and face you wasn't rage, wasn't vengeance, wasn't the want to see you punished. It was a woman who refused to let go of someone's hand when letting go would have saved her. That's the thing about choosing survival, Malrek. It only matters if you're choosing it for something worth surviving for. He stepped back. The guards moved. And Crown Prince Malrek of Ashencrest was led from the throne room without a title, without a future he'd planned for, and with 15 years of earned redemption or earned bitterness waiting ahead of him, the choice entirely and mercilessly his. The door closed. Draven stood alone before the throne for a long moment, back to the room, head slightly bowed, and Seraphine watched the breadth of his shoulders move with a long, slow exhale, like a man releasing something he'd been holding so long the muscles had forgotten how to unknot. She crossed to him. Didn't say anything. Just came to stand beside him, shoulder almost touching his, looking at the same empty throne he was looking at. "Are you all right?" she asked finally, quietly. "No," he said. Then, after a pause, "I will be." That's the honest answer. You asked for honest. I'm trying to give you that from now on. She turned toward him, studying his profile, the scars still pink against his jaw, the dark circles that would take weeks more of actual sleep to fade, the particular stillness of a man who had just made a decision in front of a council that would define how history wrote his name and knew it. "You didn't execute him," she said. Not a question, not a judgment. No. Half the council will call that weakness. Half the council thought I was a traitor 3 days ago, Draven said, mouth tipping in something that almost reached the corners of his eyes. Their opinion of my decisions carries limited weight at the moment. The other half will call it wisdom. The other half can reserve judgment for a few years and see if it turns out to be either. He finally turned toward her, and this close she could see everything his careful expression had been holding back through 3 days of testimony and deliberation and the slow, grinding machinery of an empire reassembling itself around a truth it had tried to bury. "I've been thinking about what my father said, about a king who can't be vulnerable in front of anyone eventually breaking somewhere nobody can fix. I think he was wrong about one thing." "What thing?" "He said anyone. I think he meant one person. One is enough. One person who sees the breaking happening and stays anyway, who doesn't let go when it would be easier to fall than to hold on." His hand found her jaw, the familiar gesture that had started in a winter garden and never quite stopped being exactly what it was, a man making contact with the one thing that had managed to surprise him out of every carefully constructed assumption about his own ending. "I owe you more than an apology for what I said in that clearing. I owe you the full accounting of every word I said that I didn't mean, delivered in front of every witness who heard the original, and I intend to do exactly that." "You don't need to do it publicly," Seraphine said. "I know what you said and why you said it. I understood it after. You don't owe me a performance of repentance." "No," he agreed, "but I owe you the truth of it said clearly, without an audience and without calculation. Just the plain fact." He held her gaze, gold-steadied to something quieter than she'd seen in it before. The molten intensity cooled into something more like bedrock. "I love you." I've been failing to say that in any language other than desperation and bad decisions for most of this winter, and I'm saying it now plainly because you deserve plain. I love you, and I made you believe, in a clearing in front of armed guards, that you were worthless to me, and the fact that it was strategy doesn't change the shape of the wound or my responsibility for making it. I'm sorry. Seraphine stood with those words for a moment, feeling them settle through her the way warmth settles into a body that's been cold long enough to stop remembering what warmth felt like. The weight of them was different than she'd imagined, quieter, without the grand sweep of romance she'd once been told she wasn't allowed to want. Just a man, standing in the wreckage of a winter that had tried to kill them both, saying the true thing in plain words because she'd asked him to and he'd finally learned how. "I love you too," she said. "I've been saying it in every tonic I brewed and every night I sat in that chair beside your fever bed without being asked to. You just weren't listening in the right language." His forehead dropped against hers, the careful distance he'd maintained since the bonding ceremony, dissolving entirely in a room that finally had no audience left to perform for, no strategy left to calculate, no carefully arranged lie required to keep anyone breathing. "We have a coronation to plan," he said against her hair, and there was something almost wry in the roughness of his voice, the first hint of something lighter breaking through the months of accumulated weight. "The Empire is apparently going to require a proper High King, and someone's already put my name in the ledger." "Someone put your name there a long time ago," Seraphine said. "The Empire just needed the season to catch up." The coronation happened in late spring, when the mountain passes had cleared and the last of the frost had burned away from the palace battlements, and the warmth arriving felt less like weather and more like permission. Kaelor Palace had been scrubbed of the particular atmosphere that had settled into it during the winter, the smell of fear dressed up as ceremony, the way every corridor had once felt like a path someone was watching you walk down. Some of that transformation was political. Malrek's network dismantled person by person over the course of 2 months of painstaking work by Garan, and the Council's reformed intelligence arm. Some of it was subtler, the kind of change that happens to a building when the people living in it stop expecting the floor to give way. The throne room filled with representatives from every alpha house in Ashencrest, generals and governors, and provincial lords who had waded through a winter of uncertainty to see which way the Empire's wind would finally set, and who now stood in ranks before the crystal throne with the particular alertness of men who had come expecting to witness the end of something and found instead the beginning. Queen Mother Elowyn stood at the throne's right side, the cut above her eyebrow long since healed, and looked out over the assembled court with the expression of a woman who had survived a cliff face and an assassination attempt and a winter of watching her son fight to reclaim his own name, and who had emerged from all of it with an opinion of the Empire's capacity for genuine resilience that was slightly more optimistic than it had been before. Draven was crowned High King of Ashencrest without theatrics, without the ceremonial excess that his predecessors had used to paper over the gaps between the throne's actual power and its performed magnificence. The crown was placed. The oath was taken. The assembled court witnessed it in the way that courts witness things they intend to remember, not with applause, but with the particular formal silence of a moment being committed to institutional memory. Then Seraphine walked to the throne. She had refused the Luna's ceremonial gown that the palace seamstresses had prepared, a voluminous construction of silk and brocade that would have swallowed her exactly the way every garment of her previous life had been designed to swallow her, to make her smaller, more manageable, less of a presence than the space she occupied. She wore instead deep blue wool, simply cut, the kind of garment that didn't hide anything and didn't try to. She stood before the throne, and Draven placed his hands on her shoulders, and the court watched an Alpha King who had spent a winter being declared broken, infirm, treacherous, and discarded. Look at the woman who had spent that same winter, refusing to believe any of those declarations, with an expression that carried every word of everything they'd built between them, in the particular shorthand of people who had been through something that most others in the room had no capacity to fully understand. "Imperial Luna of Ashencrest," he said, and the formal title landed differently than it had at the bonding ceremony months ago, weighted now with all the months between then and this moment. The fever bed, the battlements, the garden, the cliff, the cell, the combat circle, the clearing where he'd said the cruelest words he'd ever spoken, and she'd walked away knowing they were lies. "High King of Ashencrest," she answered, and the smile she gave him was small and private in the way that things are private even in public when both people understand that the audience for what they're saying to each other is exactly two. Elowen stepped forward, and her voice, when it carried across the throne room, had the particular carrying quality of a woman who had never needed volume to be heard. "Let the Empire understand this day," she said, looking out over the assembled houses with the calm authority of someone who had earned the right to say the next thing and intended to waste none of it. No victory claimed in this palace this winter was won by steel alone. Steel opened the path. What kept the path from closing behind it was the decision of one woman, on a collapsing cliff face in a February wind, to hold on to someone's hand when releasing it would have cost her nothing and saved her everything. The Empire will do well to remember what that kind of choice looks like, and to recognize it when it sees it again. It will see it again. Empires always give their people the opportunity to make it. Nobody applauded that either. Some things are too true to applaud. They get folded instead into the way people hold themselves for the rest of the day, carried home in the set of someone's shoulders, passed along in the retelling that happens after ceremonies end, and the actual human business of having witnessed something meaningful begins. Vesper came to the palace 2 months after the coronation, not with her usual careful performance of social confidence, but in a plain carriage, alone, dressed without the elaborate construction of status she'd always used as armor. Seraphine received her in the small receiving room off the eastern wing, not the throne room, not the formal hall, the room with the fire and the 2 chairs and the window that looked out over the palace gardens, where the frostbitten roses had come back green and insistent, despite everything the winter had tried to do to them. Vesper sat in the chair across from her, and did not perform anything for the first time in either of their memories. "I lost everything I was trying to protect," she said, looking at the fire. "Lord Rowan married into House Cauldron 6 weeks after Malrec's arrest. Fathers reduced the household to half its staff. The alliance I sacrificed you to build is gone, and the position I thought I was securing for myself went with it." A long pause. "I told myself it was strategy. I told myself you'd be fine because the king was dying and you'd be free before the year was out, and I'd have what I needed and no one would be permanently harmed by any of it. You told yourself a story that made the thing you wanted to do feel like the only reasonable option," Seraphine said, not unkindly. "People do that. I understand it better than you might think." Vesper finally looked at her, and what was in her face was something Seraphine hadn't expected to find there. Not calculation, not the guarded half-apology designed to extract maximum forgiveness with minimum genuine accounting. Something raw, something that looked like a woman who had spent the last several months in the particular silence of consequence and found it instructive in ways she hadn't anticipated. "I'm not asking to come back," Vesper said. "I'm not asking for anything. I came because I couldn't live with not saying the thing plainly to your face." She paused, and the pause had weight. "What I did to you was wrong, not strategically miscalculated, not unfortunate circumstance. Wrong. You were my sister, and I put a price on your survival that had nothing to do with your worth and everything to do with what your existence cost me, and I have spent enough months looking at what that decision produced to understand, finally, that it was wrong." The room held the words for a moment. Seraphine sat with them the way she'd sat with Draven's apology in the throne room, feeling them settle rather than rushing to respond, giving them the space they required to land honestly rather than deflected by either performance or premature absolution. "I forgive you," she said finally. "Not because what you did was small or because the forgiveness was easy to arrive at, because carrying the weight of it does me more damage than releasing it does. That's what forgiveness actually is, I think. Not a gift to the person who wronged you, a decision about what you're willing to keep spending your own life on." Vesper looked at her for a long moment, and something in her face shifted, quietly, in the particular way faces shift when they've heard something true they hadn't known they were waiting to hear. "You've changed," Vesper said. "I had the winner too," Seraphine said. "We both did. What you do with yours is still yours to decide." It wasn't a restoration, that meeting. It wasn't the warm reconciliation of sisters who had simply misunderstood each other across a temporary distance. It was something more precise and more honest than that. The beginning of a different kind of relationship between 2 people who would always carry the specific history they had with each other, who would need to build whatever came next on the foundation of what had already happened, rather than pretending the foundation didn't exist. That was harder than forgiveness and more durable than forgetting. It was enough. Setus. On the first morning of summer, when the light came in early and gold over the distant mountains and turned the palace's black stone into something that briefly looked warmer than it was, Draven led Seraphine through the doors of the highest balcony on the eastern tower, the one that looked out over the full length of the kingdom, over rooftops and fortress walls, and the long road that wound down from the mountain into the valley where the capital sat, and further than that, to the horizon where the empire became something too large to see all at once and had to be trusted instead of witnessed. His cane was gone. He'd stopped needing it 2 weeks before, the leg having healed to functionality, if not to the same fluid strength it had carried before the blood frontier. He walked with a slight hitch that would probably never fully leave him, a permanent record of everything the last year had cost his body, and he had stopped trying to hide it. Seraphine stood beside him at the balcony railing, looking out over the kingdom that had tried to kill them both through its own internal machinery of ambition and fear, and felt the morning air on her face, cold still at this elevation even in summer, the kind of cold that reminded you that you were alive rather than merely existing. "I used to stand up here when I was young," Draven said, looking at the horizon with an expression that had finally lost the exhausted vigilance it had worn through most of the winter, replaced now by something quieter and more permanent. "Before the campaigns, before the frontier. I used to think the view from this high made everything look manageable, like if you could just see far enough, you could understand the shape of it. And now I think the view from this high just shows you how much there is," he said, "how much there is to protect, and how much can go wrong, and how many people are trusting you to understand the difference between what you can control and what you have to trust." He turned toward her, the morning light catching the gold of his eyes in a way that made them look less like weapons and more like the thing they actually were, something warm, something that saw her completely, and chose that scene deliberately. "I spent most of my life believing that the only form of trust that mattered was earned trust. That love, specifically, was something you had to justify before you were allowed to feel it. Prove your worthiness, then allow the vulnerability. Do it in the other order and you were just weak." "What changed?" she asked, though she already knew the answer in the way you know the answer to a question you've been living inside for months. "I fell in love with someone before I'd had the chance to justify it," he said simply, "and it turned out to be the best decision my instincts ever made without my permission." Seraphine looked at him in the summer morning light, this man who had descended a cliff face on a broken leg without hesitating, who had said the cruelest words he knew how to say to keep her breathing, who had knelt bleeding in a combat circle and looked for her face in the gallery before anything else, who had stood before a council with his nephew in chains and chosen the harder thing over the satisfying one, and felt something in her own chest complete itself that had been building since a hall of banners and a cold bonding ceremony and a night beside a fever bed when she'd first understood the shape of what she was choosing to do. People are made, not born, by the things they survive and the choices they make in surviving them. The woman who'd arrived at Kalor Palace, hiding beneath oversized gowns and 18 years of calculated invisibility, would not have known how to stand on this balcony, to occupy this view, to hold this much space without apologizing for it. That woman had been real and had earned her own survival in her own context, and Seraphine did not dismiss her. But she was no longer only her. She had been remade by a winter she hadn't chosen and a man she hadn't expected, and a series of decisions, beginning with the one about the Queen Mother's hand on a collapsing cliff, that had accumulated into a self she recognized as entirely her own. Not given, not inherited, not sacrificed into existence by someone else's agenda. Made, by her own hands, in her own fire. That was the thing nobody told you about becoming who you actually were. It didn't feel triumphant from the inside. It felt like stubbornness, like refusing over and over in 100 small and large moments to let other people's story of you be the last word on the subject. Draven wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin coming to rest against her temple, both of them looking out over the kingdom they had nearly lost and the morning that had arrived anyway. "Every sunrise from here forward," he said quietly, an echo of something he'd promised her months ago in the small hours of a fever night when she hadn't known if he'd remember it, belongs to us both. The empire spread out beneath them, vast and unmanageable and full of the ordinary human weight of 1,000 lives being lived at whatever level of survival or joy the day allowed. And above it all, the light came in gold and indifferent and clean, no memory of the winter it had arrived after, no particular interest in the stories that had played out in the cold beneath it. Light was like that. It didn't care what it illuminated. It just kept coming, morning after morning. The same way people who had survived the worst versions of their circumstances kept choosing, in the small, persistent stubbornness of drawing breath and putting one foot down and then another to stay inside whatever life remained to them. Seraphine pressed into the warmth of her husband's arms and watched the sun come fully up over the mountains, burning the last of the morning haze from the valley, and breathed. Just that. It was enough. It was everything.